Welcome to the October 2020 Bennington Historical Society presentation, Dorothy Canfield Fisher in Arlington. Our guest today is Bill Budd. Bill is the curator of the Russell Vermontia Collection in Arlington, author of The History of Arlington, historian for the 360-year-old Scots Charitable Society, and a professional genealogist. A Flatlander from Western New York, he now lives in Arlington. The Bennington Historical Society is a volunteer-run program of Bennington Museum. The BHS offers its programs at no charge. Please consider supporting the efforts of the BHS to share the history of our region by making a donation. To do so, go to store.benningtonmuseum.org and click on Support, then Donations, then Historical Society. Please enjoy today's program.
Dorothy Canfield Fisher in Arlington, Vermont was a very interesting topic to actually start planning. Having been familiar with her, it was kind of, where do we start? One of the things that came through is that it would be enough of an ideal to do good well, like Dorothy Canfield Fisher had been quoted by Robert Frost's granddaughter. And that seemed to be one of the mainstays of her life. Do good well, not necessarily do well good. Her family actually comes from a long line from Connecticut, starting back in moving here in 1762, when they came from Connecticut with Israel and Mary Canfield. From that line, we go down to the sixth generation, which was Sally Fisher and James Canfield, Dorothy Canfield's two children. So Dorothy Canfield was actually the fifth generation to live here. This is not the generations in the United States, but generations that lived here in Vermont, in Arlington. Her heritage was very important to Dorothy. Her family goes back to New Milford, Connecticut, and some of the earliest settlers of Vermont. Mary Canfield selected the home site, and it was kind of interesting. When they arrived here, they started in Arlington checking all of the streams, all of the water sources that were along the route before they could actually pick a site where they wanted to live. And they almost left town. One of the things that happened was Mary, as a talented weaver, was concerned about having soft water so she could properly wash her linens and materials that she had previously made in Connecticut and intended to actually continue making here in Vermont. Almost left town when they found some soft water in the northern part of town along what is now Fisher Road and Route 7A. Dorothy's father, James Holm Canfield, was actually born in Delaware, Ohio. His father was Eli. Eli Canfield was an Episcopalian minister that traveled around, had several congregations throughout the eastern United States and Midwest. James was born in Delaware before moving back here at some point to settle. But his wife, Eli Canfield's wife, Martha Holm, was described as an intellectual, and she wrote stories. But she died when James was about 8 years old. And again, that's important in the whole timeline for Dorothy Canfield Fisher. 1855, when she died, James and his sister went to live with their grandmother, Elmira, in Arlington. And Aunt Mary, Aunt Mary Ann, they both lived in the brick house at that time, along with Zadok Canfield. Now, the same year, 1855, that they moved out here to live in the house, his grandfather, Nathaniel, died. And that left three elderly people there, Elmira, Mary Ann, and Zadok. James kind of fit right in and rolled with the punches, I guess. But his grandmother was a very strong character. She really set a lot of the stage for his future development. the strong woman in his life. His mother died, so she took over that role, basically. She had a great respect for education and was well known for that in the town. Story is told that she had a handyman that worked for her, that she discovered one day he couldn't read. And she took it upon herself to help him learn to read. She taught him to read so that he could basically be part of the town and take part in a larger world of writing and literature and education. Another trait that seems to show up is she was a strong abolitionist. At the time in 1855, there was a lot of debate about what states were going to be free states and what states were going to be slave states. She was one of the abolitionists that lived in town here. Again, one of those classic stories that Dorothy shared is the fact that on the day that John Brown was hung, the day that he died, she woke up James, her grandson, sent him across the road to the St. James Episcopal Church and had him start ringing the bell, tolling the bell in mourning for the death of James Brown, or John Brown, rather. Throughout the day, they recruited other young men in town to continue ringing the bell throughout the day to mark this as a very sad occasion. And again, it's one of those stories that made a big impression on people. James went on to become a professor in economics and sociology, taught University of Kansas for a while. Very popular, very good, and obviously very competent and talented teacher. He was asked in 1889 to be president of the National Education Association. That's kind of a big deal at that point. 2 years later, he became chancellor at the University of Nebraska when Dorothy Canfield Fisher was only 12. So he kind of moved up very quickly in this process. In 1895, his skills as a University of Nebraska chancellor were recognized, and he was hired as the president of Ohio State University. Both of that, chancellor at the University of Nebraska, president of Ohio State, only lasted about 5 years. I think it's kind of an interesting time period that he seemed to move quickly from one to the other to the other. Part of it was he didn't necessarily make good friends with the changes he implemented. Especially at Ohio State, it was talked about how he just kind of upset the apple cart and wasn't really appreciated by everybody. 1899, he moved on to a position as a librarian at Columbia University. And it's, again, interesting that he did not see this as a come down, as a demotion. He basically saw his role as a librarian as the gatekeeper for people accessing knowledge. And it's a way to continue education by providing resources to the students and to the faculty and to the community at large as well. That was one of his themes at Ohio State, was integration with the community and increasing the enrollment and the tight ties with the community in surrounding Ohio State. And again, very successful, but stepped on some toes in the process. Dorothy's mother is a real interesting person, much more flamboyant than James Home Canfield. She was born in 1847 in Black Earth near Ridgway, Wisconsin. There are tales about log cabins out there at that time period. Both of Flavia's parents grew up in Rutland County before they moved west. And it's kind of an interesting process that Albert Camp, her father, Flavia's father, was basically what we would describe today as a pioneer in the terms of going to the frontier. Probably much like we considered Israel Canfield, Dorothy's first ancestor in Arlington, to be a pioneer as well. Moving to the frontier and establishing, home and family, and that's making that work for him. He also seemed to be a bit of an entrepreneur. 1849, when the gold rush opened up in California, he went west, like so many people did. Unfortunately, he caught it was either diphtheria or another one of those contagious diseases that just kind of ripped through the mining camps out there and died in 1849. Flavia's mother very quickly remarried Reverend Allen, and they lived together and combined their two families to have a rather large combined family at that point. Flavia's mother, Martha Barney, again, there's this theme. She was an intellectual, described as an intellectual who wrote stories as well. And that it seems to come together, a couple generations. And it shows up most strongly in Dorothy Canfield Fisher's generation and her activity. Flavia, this is basically described as by Ida Washington as artistic, highly gifted, and irresponsible. Gifted artist, very bright, very intelligent, but she seemed to flit around a lot. She taught art at the University of Wisconsin, very socially involved at the universities and colleges that the family was affiliated with. She studied at a number of universities. She sketched and painted 3, sometimes 4 days a week. And you see in her diaries that she talks about how she was working on things, revising, different sketches and trying different things, and, studying art at different museums. Very bright, but it all sounds like attention deficit disorder type behavior, at least getting excited about whatever comes along and having a hard time focusing on it for any period of time. She traveled to Europe to study, sometimes accompanied by Dorothy, who served as a translator in France and Paris. Get the impression Dorothy wasn't always happy about having to go along and be the translator and having to do the interface between Flavia and the community. Flavia never learned really to speak French and relied on other people to do that work for her. Again, Flavia is another theme that shows up, strong abolitionist views in her background. I mentioned very outgoing, strong-willed. She's a talented organizer. At Ohio State, she organized probably 5 or 6 or 7 different clubs and organizations, societies in the town, some around art and some were actually around other topics, women's groups to do reading or some activity. But she always had something in the pot. She always had something going, sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a day, or planning for the next meeting with other club members. As you look through her diary, those are themes that keep coming up. She did write several books, so she has a writer's background to it too. She's more of an artist. She wrote her last book when she was 80 years old, and that was the image of Flavia in the cart that was during her world trip around the world. Dorothy, getting back to Dorothy, she was born 1879 in Lawrence, Kansas. Died 1958 in Arlington, Vermont. A lot of photographs of Dorothy around. One of the things that I was impressed with is the large number of photographs of Dorothy as she was growing up. And I had the impression that Flavia was a very visually oriented person. And the photographs were a great way to take the images of Dorothy and preserve those visually. She did work on painting Dorothy, and there's some notes about that in her diaries. But again, the photographs that show up are really interesting. Lawrence, Kansas was also known as a large group of Vermonters in that area, as well as a large group of abolitionist sentiment that pervaded the area as well. And so that tended to reinforce things, tended to keep Vermont in mind and fresh, talks they could share with other neighbors and people they knew. Dorothy spent summers in Vermont. Her Aunt Mattie's, her Aunt Martha, known as Aunt Mattie, kept a diary about different activities during the day, as many of these people did. Her diary entries often referred to when Dorothy was there, what did she do, how she was feeling, was she ill, that type of thing. So we get an idea, a feel for the types of activities, the people that Dorothy was associating with. Now the brick house where they lived in was built around 1830 by a fellow named Phineas Smith, an architect, who also designed the St. James Church across the street. He did not live there very long. And the house reverted back to Sylvester Deming, who originally sold Smith the property. By 1845, the Reverend Eli Hawley was living there, basically renting at that time. And finally, 1856, he purchased the house. So it became part of another Canfield house in the town. There were other Canfield homes around the town as well, especially on Water Street. It was known as Canfield Village because of the number of Canfields that lived there and had built homes there. The other two main homes for Canfields were north on Route 7A around Fisher's Road, at this, what's known as Fisher Road at this point. The house changed how it looked several times over the years. First, there's no fence, no porch. They added a porch to the front. And they also had this wonderful fence. It wasn't a picket fence, but it was this wonderful fence along the front that I kind of miss fences these days. But also along the top, along the roof line, there was this kind of balustrade up there that helped add some details to the features of the house. All of these photographs, you can see people, Canfields in the photographs. Somebody sitting on the stool here or the block to get on, horse wagons. Here's somebody sitting in the doorway. There's somebody standing here. There are always people that are in these mainly for, scale in many cases. By 1907, the fence was gone, but the mounting stone was still there. And this wonderful porch, you get to appreciate how nice this porch looked in front of the house. Now, at that time, when Dorothy was visiting, there were 4 relatives living there. Zadok, known as Uncle Zed, was living there. He's listed as one of the owners on the map. Aunt Mary was living there as well. These are all brothers and sisters. And then Aunt Mattie, who was kind of, taking care of everybody. The spinster sister in the family that was responsible for making sure everybody was staying healthy and getting meals and taken care of. And then grandfather Eli, who at this point is in a wheelchair. I'm guessing this is probably around 1890 or so. And he looks pretty old and he looks pretty frail at this point. But these are all people when Dorothy and her brother Jimmy went to visit. They got to share experiences and stories and really get to know them very well. In particular, Eli, grandfather Eli, seemed to be very important in, they called her Dolly, but Dorothy's life. Flavia, Dorothy, and Jimmy, her brother, would go to visit during the summers. Later, as they grew up, the children grew older, Jimmy and Dorothy would go on their own and take the train. This letter from 1888, the day after Dorothy's birthday, I thought was very interesting. And she writes to her grandfather, "I was 9 years old yesterday. her presence, I got a room of my own as large as Mama's. That was very important to her. She was kind of growing into her own now. She was beginning to own her own space and become her own person. It was even bigger than Jimmy's room, which I thought was interesting. Her father also made her a maple, or bookshelf that was finished to look like cherry wood, where she could put all her books. And again, that was one of those important things that she shared with her grandfather. A few years later, 1892, she writes to her grandfather in May. Apparently, her father had gone to visit in Arlington for some reason. When he returned, she writes that, "I fancied myself in Arlington a good many times since Papa got back. He has been telling us so many little things that seem so familiar." So she's already established by 1892 this relationship with Arlington as kind of a base, that she's heard stories and tales and gossip and family history, that it all sounds like she can imagine herself back there in that spot as her father tells her what he saw and what he experienced, and share that visit with her. The visits to Arlington left a deep, lasting impressions on Dorothy, and that really comes through in her writing and her novels and short stories, and whether or not they deal with Arlington itself or her stories about life in general. One thing that was coming across as I went through the records and she seemed to be telling people, is that Arlington seemed to have a lot less tension than she felt at home. And she would share with Pearl Buck that her parents were unable to make each other happy. So it was not a very comfortable place emotionally necessarily. I think you kind of pick up that edge that Arlington had this kind of almost fairy tale, more relaxed place where she could be herself, that she didn't have to worry about the tension or offending one parent or the other when she was in Arlington. I have to wonder if there were fewer expectations to excel in Arlington too. Her father, a noted college professor, college president, college chancellor, librarian at Columbia University. A lot of pressure there to be literate and educated and take education seriously. Her mother, too, seemed to have some high expectations in some ways, but in a different vein. Her mother seemed not to really relate to Dorothy or Jimmy as much as her father did. So the mother was kind of distant. And I wonder if there was some pressure to try and excel to, maybe please her mother. And it's getting very psychiatric and psychological, but you can almost see the tension in the family between the two places, the two groups of people, and where she really felt comfortable and at home. Her visits to her elder Canfield relatives really left lasting memories, as I mentioned before, because they were all great talkers, great tellers of stories of old times in Vermont. And some of the best memories we have from childhood are the stories and tales that are shared between families. We talk about going camping and having the experience of telling ghost stories or around the campfire and that type of thing, and what an impression that makes on us. Stories about holidays and growing up are things that are often shared in families. I mentioned the photographs before, and it's interesting to watch the photographs progress, because you can go from that first photograph at 2 years old to this photograph at age 13. The expression is kind of sullen almost, and not wanting to have to be there. Her next year at 14, she looks much more mature and much more relaxed and confident in herself. Looks like she's looking more into the future with her eyes here. But what impressed me the most were the sleeves on the dress. It's just amazing sleeves. In her home with her father and her mother, birthdays were not always celebrated at home. And one of the diary entries from Flavia in 1892 notes in a rare entry about the kids that Dorothy's birthday was not celebrated by the family. She has candy and flowers from schoolmates and a coffee spoon from the Westerman family. But that's it. No celebration, no cake, no recognition. And basically, she spent the afternoon going downtown for errands. Interestingly, she mentions that I go to the university to paint about 8, spend 3 hours working on a sketch of willows on the Batten Kiln, which is spelled a Batten Kiln, K-I-L-N. So there was still that connection to Vermont that was going through a lot of what she was doing. Let's see, 1897, again on Dorothy's birthday, February 17th. No mention of her children or of Dorothy's birthday. Appointment tomorrow with someone coming to their house. She has a club meeting day before, sketch club. Afterwards, go to bell ringers and in Bond. So, but again, that distance from the family is really interesting to note. One of her rare diary mentions is, Dorothy and I go downtown to have a photo taken of her and go on errands. And I think this is that same photograph. The date on the photograph is pretty much 1897, but it's a really beautiful, study of the two of them. And I'm impressed by the clothing. The color of the clothing is rather somber in the black and white photograph, but high collars and both. But both look, I think it's a very good photograph of them. Really beautifully framed and processed. Okay. So at this point, it's 1897, 1899. 1897, she's enrolled in Ohio State College. Gets her BA from Ohio State in 1899. And one of the photographs in that time period is of the sorority that Dorothy Canfield was part of. I think, again, that clothing is really interesting to see. They're all pretty much similar to the same style. And Dorothy is here in front. Looking directly at the camera and seeming very confident, very self-assured of herself and where she's been and where she's going at this point. Seems like she has a vision of the future of some sort. She went on, when her father moved to Columbia, she took advantage of that and took a PhD in Romance languages in 1904. The timing of her degrees is interesting. Her bachelor degree was at Columbia when her father was president there. Probably a discount in the tuition. PhD at Columbia. Her father was librarian there, very close to the president of Columbia. So again, probably a discount there. So from a financial viewpoint, it was good planning, it seems. Dorothy was described as a physically active woman. She liked to hike and there are stories describing hikes along the Palisades, along the Hudson River. And there's this wonderful photograph from Herbert Wheaton Condon in 1905 of them along the Palisades, along the Hudson River in New York. Also, this photograph in 1907 was just wonderful of out skiing on Red Mountain behind the house. The old, you don't have 2 ski poles, you have 1 pole to balance, and you use it to, kind of make sure you stay upright as you go downhill. There was a real skill that I think was really wonderfully shared and good development for many reasons. The other one that struck me, and there are actually two, was Dorothy Canfield Fisher target practicing with the pistol. And there's also a companion photograph of her lying prone on the ground, taking target practice with a rifle. It looks like a small 22 type rifle, but not afraid to be out there and doing these things. Being a real kind of country girl in many ways, but not afraid to get her hands dirty to be part of the process of enjoying, rural, Vermont. And a lot of those experiences show up in her stories too. 1907, John Fisher married Dorothea Frances Canfield. John had wanted to have married and be engaged to Dorothy for a long time. And she finally agreed, and it was probably an excellent reunion and choice. They just seemed to have worked really well together throughout the rest of their life. Similar values in education, concerns. John became kind of an editor and sounding board for much of what Dorothy Canfield wrote. So they worked well together in that sense. Moved immediately right up to the house on what's now Fisher Road, the house and the road up to the old Israel Canfield place. Along, you can just see on the far left side here, there's a stream that goes down there, and there used to be a mill up there. And Israel Canfield had a mill up there. It also had a tanning business up there that he did. The remains of the mill are still visible if you know what to look for up there. But a very modest house, nothing very spectacular, very comfortable looking, very ordinary looking. And some of the best photographs from Herbert Wheaton Condon are Dorothy and John inside the house or sitting on the porch, and here with their cat. And just wonderful thing reading, and John smoking his pipe, very comfortable setting. Her first novel was The Squirrel Cage. It was published in 1912. I think the first thing she ever wrote was an article for the New York Times that she was really surprised that they published. But her first novel was The Squirrel Cage. It was published in 1912. I thought the inside cover was very interesting in terms of the publisher put this photo or this illustration here, and the caption is, "Paul stood by her, looking down into her eyes, bending over her, pressing, confident, masterful." It sounds very much like a male-dominated setting. I wonder how she felt about that at that time. I wonder if he consulted her at that time about having that particular caption and illustration in her book. 1915, Hillsborough People, her first book that relates more to Arlington, was published. It's a collection of short stories about Vermonters on the surface, but in reality, they're described as thinly veiled stories about her Arlington experiences. A lot of what shows up later on in some of her later works is kind of, you get hints of that at this point in her life, that what's coming are going to be things she knows, things she's familiar with. And this kind of lays the groundwork for that. With occasional Vermont verses by Sarah and Cleghorn. Sarah and Cleghorn and Dorothy became very close friends and remained so for the rest of their lives. Sarah was a talented poet who lived in Manchester, described as a socialist, so kind of a firebrand at times in terms of her relationship to issues. Um, Dorothy seemed to be more the voice of reason, I think, in the relationship. But again, there are a couple of good photographs that show the two of them together and doing different activities. Other Vermonters that they became close to moved into the area later on and were kind of transplants. One that writer that she became close to was in Dorset, Zephine Humphrey. Another later on that she became close to was Robert Frost, who basically settled in Shaftesbury with some serious encouragement by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. 1916, John volunteers as an ambulance driver in France during World War I. The same year Dorothy and the children follow, a couple months after that. She writes letters home. They're impressive letters. They're single-spaced, typed, often multiple pages, 2 or more pages, describing her experiences in France and with the work that she's doing there. Marvelously detailed and really revealing some of what's going on in her life in a way that is very expressive. This, I have to admit, is probably the first time this month that I've actually started to look into those letters in our collection. Subject to publishing some of what she writes about them. But at that time in France, she becomes heavily involved in humanitarian work. Her first big humanitarian project, formal one probably, is helping to organize the publication of Braille books and magazines for the blind, mainly, I get the impression, for blind soldiers at the time, but also for everybody else. Once she set that project up, she was doing a number of other things, canteen for some of the soldiers with the Red Cross. And she was talking about feeling overwhelmed and not being able to say no when she was asked by the Red Cross to help set up a convalescent home for children affected by the war. And this was set up in the Basque Country, the border with Spain. So the Basque Country of France and Spain. She did an excellent job of that, and that continued part of her work with the Red Cross. But that led eventually, several years later, to writing about her experiences in the book called Basque People. And a lot of them sound familiar to people here in Arlington and Vermont, and her experiences. People are people no matter where you go. The experiences may be different, but the life events are the same no matter where you are. That seemed to come through several times. So Dorothy and her relationship with Arlington, all this up to this point has been kind of background. What are her values? Who influenced her? How did she relate to the world in many ways? And that led to how she related to the people here in Arlington and what people in Arlington, for the most part, there were some that didn't necessarily agree with her or approve of her or like her, but for the most part, people seemed to respect and honor her. But why was that? Well, based on her early experiences growing up and her visits to Arlington and life in general, her deep roots in Vermont and Arlington made a huge impression. The stories she heard from her aunts and uncles and grandfather Eli at the brick house made a lasting impression about historic roots and where people belonged and could find a sense of acceptance and comfort. Summers spent at the brick house as she was growing up removed this kind of label of as an outsider. They kind of mellowed that label that she was here enough for enough years so that she established relationships, with children her own age in town, as well as with some of the adults. Um, People knew when she came who she was. So she wasn't seen as this stranger. She wasn't seen as somebody who didn't belong here or somebody that may have been a threat to them. She was one of us. That's how they felt and had seen her during those times. She wasn't known for putting on airs. She did not, as far as I can tell, see herself as better than anybody else. And that made a big impression too. One of the themes that come through some of her work is the idea that visitors and people to the area often feel, well, the country bumpkins, and I'm from the big city, whether it's Albany, New York City, or whatever. There's this dichotomy, there's this hierarchy. But she wasn't known for reinforcing that. She wasn't known as the person that put on those airs. She didn't flout it and say, this is what I know, and you don't know anything. That made a big impression too. She also seemed to have a deep sense of genuine empathy toward others. I'm guessing from her experience growing up with her mother and father, who were not the most emotional or supportive of each other, maybe. She really was able to stand back and see that and compare that to the genuine relationships that she found between her family members and other people in other places, especially her family in Arlington. The elders took care of each other. We have the 4 elderly Canfield living in the same house for many years, caring for each other. It may not have been easy at times. They may not have always liked it the most. People were sick. People get cranky. People get on each other's nerves. But they generally cared about each other, and they cared about other Canfield family members in the area. And that type of empathy that she was able to observe, she was able to emulate and convey to other people as well. She also had this wonderful ability to relate to and describe the emotional experiences of the people around her. She may not have said much at the time, but she was able to observe relationships and experiences between folks. And then be able to put those into words. It's really a difficult thing to do, but she had a real talent, a natural gift to be able to do that. And you find throughout her writings and her books and her magazine articles, this ability to describe relationships and how people were feeling and seeing each other inside situations, not just describing the situation, but how they were inside that situation that they were experiencing at the time. Very rare skill. The other thing is her income with her publishing grew. She offered financial support as appropriate to different people around town, whether they were loans or, just buying something for somebody, or in several cases, she really was known and felt really good about helping to pay for college education for some of the students graduating from Arlington High School. She paid, I know in one case, for the tuition for one of her student that she looked out for at Castleton, at that time, Castleton Normal School, so she could become a teacher. And that student came back here to town and continued as a teacher after she graduated. But that type of respect and looking out for each other was something that people valued as well. Again, there were people that probably saw that as her putting on airs, maybe, but people may not take those types of things the right way and see them as somebody who genuinely cares about each other and sharing that. Another reason, despite her financial success, she didn't put on airs or seem better than her neighbors. And the clearest way I found for that is to compare her home on Fisher Road to the other homes in town for people that were well off, maybe not as famous as her, not as wealthy as her, but they had bigger, fancier homes, newer homes. But her home was a very humble size home that didn't have the latest conveniences, but it was safe. It was cozy. And the big thing that came across is the coziness of the house. Wonderful gardens around the house, but in this photograph, you can't see them. It's probably early in the season, and they're not really grown. But beautiful gardens that were planted around the yard. You see some really nice hollyhocks here, look like black-eyed Susans maybe. And she loved it. She really met people and talked to people in the middle of her gardens. And the photographs are wonderfully comfortable. She also personally reached out to the Arlington residents and other people too, but our focus here is Arlington residents. Well known for sending Christmas cards. Her Christmas cards get back to the photographs that you see so much in her growing up. Merry Christmas to Martha from Dorothy Canfield Fisher. This one on the right here is Merry Christmas to Bessie from Dorothy Canfield Fisher. And what I found interesting is that it's not John and Dorothy Canfield Fisher or Dorothy and John. It's Dorothy Canfield Fisher. So there was a special relationship between Dorothy Canfield Fisher and the individual she sent this card to. Not afraid to as well help people make connections. This card for Edgar Lawrence. Fisher wrote, introducing my Vermont friend and neighbor, Edgar Lawrence. Edgar Lawrence was a friend of the family, lived in Sunderland, and she signed it Dorothy Canfield Fisher. I'm not sure who it was written to introduce him to, but again, she was willing to share relationships that she knew and help other people establish relationships that she valued as well, because she trusted them and she trusted the people that she was referring to, other people. So actually, Edgar Lawrence is related to one of our attendees here, Hap Lawrence, who also was the son of Edgar Lawrence in Sunderland here. Fisher also won friends and by giving credit to people. She gave a lot of credit to others, and you see this most clearly in the cast list of the different productions they put on in Arlington and the surrounding area too, Manchester as well. She was well known for writing plays and pageants and all sorts of little skits, and they were presented over the years in town here. What cast list we have are very interesting because they represent people from all walks of life in Arlington and the surrounding towns. The one on the left, Arlington celebrates 150 years of the Constitution. The people in this, Prosper Duchesne, brought electricity to Arlington. He worked at the Hale Company for probably 50 years at least. Very active in the town, select board, water company, literally brought electricity to town here and organized that. The Works Progress Administration had a big role in town as well, and you find works that help to support different artists. Over on the right-hand side, Thanksgiving in Arlington, 1791, written by Dorothy Canfield Fisher, presented at the Arlington High School. Norman Rockwell was one of the cast members in this. The Kehoe family, Brush family, are still, descendants here in town. It's amazing Again, there's Edgar Lawrence over here. Hard family is one of the early founding families of town. Brush family, Frederick Brush and Lester Brush were sons of the minister at St. James Episcopal Church. Orlando Cullinan, another early family in Orlando, was well known in town and very popular. Orlando's descendants are still living in town, which is amazing. And this is kind of an interesting transition here. Dorothy Canfield Fisher wrote Tourist Accommodated, a play, and it was put on a number of times to raise money for the community. This is on the left, 1934 Vermont Commission on Country Living edition. And we'll get into that in a moment. Another production of that, it was slightly revised, but 1952, there was another version of that. Included Norman Rockwell, the artist Gene Hughes, artist Don Trachty, and artist Vic Dollar-Hyde, along with many of the local the residents. And they kind of performed these things hand in hand and side by side. So kind of reduced that distance, that social distance that sometimes develops in small communities. It kept people talking to each other. People recognized each other and were able to say hi and feel good about that. Okay, this transition up to Dorothy Canfield Fisher was a very prolific writer, very prolific speaker, very, very much respected, member of the board of selection for the Book of the Month Club for many years. But one of the activities she became involved with was the Vermont Commission on Country Life. And this had originally started off as part of the eugenics survey. And towards the end of the eugenics survey, it was expanded into the Vermont Commission on Country Life. It put a final report together called Rural Vermont, a program for the future by 200 Vermonters. And she was part of the conservation of Vermont traditions and ideals in terms of her contributions. It was this participation that eventually led to a few years ago, some controversy about her work. She agreed to work on the committee. The recommendations were that Vermont should actively recruit artists, and others in the same classification to vacation here. And the hope was that these sojourners could be convinced to relocate permanently. Now, one of the problems they were trying to address was the fact that we still face the problem of the youth leaving Vermont and the declining population we have here. It's been going on ever since probably 1850 or so. How do you get them to come back to the farm? How do you keep people here in Vermont? What type of people in terms of residents do we want that will help make Vermont more and continue its growth and maintain its good name in the world? Well, the eugenics movement thought one way to do that was through population control. And that was one part of it that was very much not spoken of too much in the Vermont Commission for Conservation of Country Life. They kind of downplayed that at that point because it was becoming unpopular, as Hitler really picked up in Europe on the idea of eugenics and focused on controlling the Aryan majority in Germany and minimizing the what they considered unsavory population. It lost favor here. So it became a question about how do we attract people to Vermont that are literate, education, rich and wealthy enough to maintain our Vermont lifestyle. Throughout the Vermont Commission on Country Living report, racism is implied, but it's not specifically identified. And the connection to eugenics was very elusive in that report. It was very well written in that sense. But Dorothy Canfield Fisher became embroiled in that when her understood Betsy, tourist accommodated, and understood Betsy were seen as being racist, and mentions of this uneducated, illiterate French Canadians that she wrote about in that, the lower class that people did not want to take into their tourist accommodations, and the unsavory, undesirable Jewish vacationers, and that became a focus. And part of the problem is that, and I think Mark Madigan points out, she did participate in the activities of the commission, but she never advocated the biological engineering that was supported by the eugenics movement. Unfortunately, that's what people have focused on in the past 10 years. And that has resulted in the Children's Book Award, the Dorothy Canfield Award for Children's Literature, being renamed at this point. And there are people on both sides of the argument that have valid arguments. My own personal feeling is that racial slurs that occur in her work are most often taken out of context. Dorothy Canfield Fisher was a reporter of what she saw in her life and the world around her, sometimes verbatim. And recording that has gotten her into some trouble in interpretation, especially when these descriptions were taken out of context. However, they could be very accurate representations of the period. And sometimes what we don't remember is that may not apply today, but that's what was being seen and observed and experienced at the time period it was written. Complaints about the tourists are still rife in the restaurant and hospitality industry. I still get frustrated at the number of out-of-town cars that seem to be lost as I tried to go from here to Manchester or Bennington. Especially leaf season has an influx of people. They upset my habits in part, but they also bring a lot of valuable income and viewpoints and a different perspective that we need to be aware of. Dorothy Canfield Fisher was very good at identifying and describing these types of things, experiences in life. Personally, I think highlighting her work to bring artists to Vermont, like Francis Ruggs, Rockwell, Atherton, George Hughes, writers like Robert Frost, and composers. Calabro, who was in charge of the music department at Bennington College. We also have, I can't remember his name, contemporary with Charles Ives, who lived here in Arlington, well-known composer and modern artist. These also fulfilled the goals of the Vermont Commission on Country Living, but they were also good for Vermont. And it's easy to overlook that. I think we need to maintain some balance in our perspective and context. That's about all I have at this point. Be willing to entertain any comments, questions, etc. that that have been submitted at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. What a wonderful, whoa, hold on, we've got somebody else's screen here. A wonderful overview of Dorothy Canfield Fisher and her life, and her fascinating family as well. I do want to acknowledge that we're a little over 3 o'clock here, so if anybody needs to leave, that is okay. You can do that, but if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to type into the chat that I can share with Bill, we're happy to take those. I do want to, I don't know if you noticed or not, but Hap Lawrence, who you mentioned as part of the audience today, wanted to point out that Shirley Lawrence Latique, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong, Shirley, who is in Sutherland, is also Edgar Lawrence's daughter, and she is part of our audience this afternoon as well. David asks, which book by Dorothy Canfield Fisher would you recommend as the one to read first?
That's a tough one. I would have to say Arlington's People. She wrote 2 histories of Arlington, Vermont, slightly different versions, one for the raising money for the Historical Society and one for mass publication. And those are very good, describing the local experiences that she had and some of the values that she gained out of that. The other is probably Understood Betsy, is very popular and very widely read by many people. Squirrel Cage, I'm not too sure about, her first novel, but that would be interesting in terms of comparison. But definitely the one of the 2 local Arlington, Vermont books.
And Ruth just would like to thank you for all of the historic photographs that you shared with us today as well. I loved the one myself of Dorothy, doing target practice. That was a fun one.
Yeah.
Not what I expected.
I know. She just seems so out of character for her, but that was part of her in it. So.
Sure. Jennifer asks where the diaries and photographs are kept. Where do those live?
The Russell Vermontiana collection, the Martha Canfield Library in Arlington.
Great.
There's also a large collection at UVM of her work and in their library up there, their archive.
Wonderful. It doesn't look like there's any more questions. If anyone wants to pop anything else in, now's your chance. Otherwise, I will, on behalf of the Historical Society, thank you so much, Bill. And thanks to all of our audience members today for joining us. We will make a recording of this program available. I unfortunately hit the record button a little late. I forgot. So I might have missed the first couple of slides, but the rest of the program will be available on the Historical Society's webpage, as well as the Bennington Museum's YouTube channel. And again, I encourage you all to join us for future Historical Society programs. They happen on the 3rd Sunday of almost every month. The next one we have coming up will be led by Bob Taggart, and it will be, again, on Zoom, teaching us how to research our ancestors that were involved in the military. So that should be quite interesting. Again, thank you so much, Bill. This was really interesting and informative, and so glad that we were all able to be a part of it.
You're welcome. Thank you.